everyone, it's Lisa Ross, though you may know me better as Paper Daisy Creations. And today I'm going to be showing you how to work the heel flap, the turned heel, and the gusset for these Step into Christmas socks. Now, I've created this video with lots of information, but I know not all of you will need all of the information. So use the chapter links listed in the description below, and that will take you right to the point in the video that you need to see. And remember that you can always click those chapter links to go back to a certain skill if you need to review it. All right, let's get started talking about the construction of this sock. This uses what is called a heel flap and gusset. The heel flap is this rectangle right here. Now, you're seeing it right now attached, but I'm going to show you it unattached in just a minute. You'll also see the bottom of the heel. I've created what's called a turned heel. So I took that heel flap and I turned it and I worked this little semicircle shape to create the bottom of the heel. You'll also see a very unique gusset. This is a triangle gusset that goes along the bottom of the heel, and at this point it is just now finished off. So I'm going to show you all the steps on how to work the heel flap, the turned heel, the gusset setup, and to finish off that gusset. When working this Eye of the Partridge heel flap for my knitting, I'm going to begin with the first stitches of the round. Now, these stitches had all been on these 9-inch circular needles, but I was using my smaller set of double points in order to make this heel flap. And so I began right here across the first half of the stitches. And so I worked across this first row, decreasing stitches so that I had the correct stitch count. Now, because I was using these 9-inch circular needles, I just let go. I left all of these stitches on hold on the 9-inch circulars. And then I worked my heel flap, in which I was knitting back and forth just across those stitches, working right side and wrong side rows. All right, let's talk for a minute about the heel flap. Now, you may not be familiar with that term heel flap if you are new to sock knitting, but a heel flap is a rectangular bit of fabric that is worked flat, so worked back and forth, right side and wrong side, on just some of the stitches. And it creates this little flap right here that we're going to be connecting to make the rest of our socks. All right, so let's talk about this heel flap. Now, there are many different types of heel flaps. You could work this just in stockinette, you could work it in ribbing, you could work it in slip stitches. We are working a specific kind of slip stitch knitting for this heel flap called an Eye of the Partridge heel. And if you wanted, you could look that up separately to find out a little bit more information about the Eye of the Partridge heel. Depending on what kind of yarn you're using and what color your yarn is, you may or may not see the patterning pop up. It forms a bit of a checkerboard effect, and if you take your knitting and hold it up to the light, you'll be able to see the little alternating dots of light come through this, but you may not see it in the video, unfortunately. On the reverse side, on the wrong side, you're going to see these little slipped stitches. So it's little strands of yarn that go across the back of the sock and they alternate. So these are on the wrong side of our knitting. We have these little loops and you may or may not see them. Again, this is a very dark yarn, so it's not going to be quite as visible, but hopefully in your knitting you'll begin to see those little alternating loops or strands, sorry, they're not really loops, that go across the wrong side of the heel flap. Now, I have chosen to use an Eye of the Partridge heel flap for this design for a couple of reasons. One is that it makes a very dense fabric. So in the body of our sock, we have all of these strands which are creating really thick socks, very dense socks. And this heel flap, with those strands, it's going to make a much more dense heel flap that is going to be more in line with the rest of the sock. The other reason that I do it is that I need to have a certain number of stitches in order to make the gusset work. I want this to be a great fitting sock, and the gusset will use a lot of stitches, much more than you would find on some of my other sock designs that are knit with just a single color. And so this is the perfect heel flap to create those extra stitches. Now, if you are a seasoned sock knitter and have lots of experience with knitting various heels, you can modify the heel, but it's at your own risk. Let me tell you, you are going to need a certain stitch count in order to work the gusset as it is written. So some sock knitters know that they need X number of rows for their foot. But I can tell you that if you choose to do that, if you choose to make this shorter or longer, you're going to have to modify the stitch count when we do the stitch pickup. And that could be by adding stitches along the turned heel after you've turned the heel, so working some make one lefts along the needle, or it could be by picking up extra stitches along the side, and that would be if you've made your heel flap shorter. If you've made it longer, you of course will have to decrease some stitches, and I would recommend either doing it here along this needle once we've turned the heel, or just picking up fewer stitches along the sides. And because you want your sock to be symmetrical, you would want to omit the same number of stitches on the left side as you do on the right side. So that's just a little tip for modifying your knitting. All right, now while we are working this heel flap, I'm ready to work my final heel flap row. And so I'm going to go ahead and show you how I do it. Now, what we're doing while working these wrong side rows is alternating which stitches are slipped. And if I'm ever confused about what row I'm on, I like to look down at the previous row that had slipped stitches. So it's not going to be right up here at the top because our right side rows were worked just as knit stitches. But I need to go down to where the first stitches were slipped, and you'll see these longer strands across the wrong side of the sock. Now, keep in mind that it's going to be really tough to see in the video, and so hopefully you are able to read your own knitting much better than looking at this dark yarn in this video. But here are some of these strands of the yarn that was slipped across the back. And what I like to do is sort of pay attention to where the stitch was slipped in the previous wrong side row. So this one right here was a slipped stitch right there, which means that on this row, that will be a purl stitch. And I like to kind of work my way back. So purl, slip, slip. Now, that may be a bit confusing, but if you're tracking your knitting and you know which row you are on, it won't be a problem for you. I just tend to set my knitting down a lot or get distracted, or, I'm watching a show or something. And so I need to know what I'm up to at this point. So essentially, any stitch that was slipped on the most recent wrong side row, that will be a purl stitch. And any stitch that was a purl stitch, which is harder to see because it's this tiny little purl right here, that will be a slipped stitch on this row. Now I begin with the yarn held in front, and I'm slipping the first stitch purlwise. Then I'm going to purl, slip one with yarn held in front, purl, slip one, purl, slip one, purl. Now, as I'm going across this wrong side row, I like to just double check and make sure that I'm slipping the correct stitches because I don't want to have a vertical line of slip stitches. I want them to be alternating. Now, hopefully you can see, but perhaps not. This second stitch has the slipped stitch down below it. The first stitch is just purl stitches until you get down here, which was several rows ago. So I know that because this was purled on the most recent wrong side row, that one is going to be slipped, this one. And here you can see, as I've pulled my stitch over to the side, that slip stitch kind of becomes longer and a little bit more obvious. So I know that that was a slipped stitch on the previous wrong side row. That will be a purl stitch on this one. I'm going to go ahead and work my way across. All right, I've worked all of my heel flap rows and I'm ready to turn the heel. Now, if you're not sure how many rows you've knit, it's tricky to just start in the middle and start counting up because we've been slipping alternating stitches. So there is no single column that is all stockinette except for one of the very first columns in which we've been working purl stitches. I find it easiest though to look at my selvage stitches. So the selvage edge is going to be where I worked my slipped stitches, and it's going to tend to want to curl in, but you can see these stitches right here. So it's sort of a stockinette looking line of stitches that we're going to have to use when we work our pickup. And I can count all of those selvage stitches to be sure that I have the correct number of selvage stitches. You're going to have half as many selvage stitches as you will for the number of rows. So for example, if my heel flap is 42 rows long, I will have 21 selvage stitches. And so that's how I like to keep count and know if I'm in the right place, is by counting each of these selvage stitches to be sure that I have the right number. Now, I've got the right number and I'm ready to work my heel flap. The heel flap is going to create a little semicircle right here. This flat heel is going to start to curve just by working some short rows. Now, don't be intimidated by the short rows. We're not doing any wrap and turn kind of things. It's going to become pretty obvious what you're doing because of the gaps that will appear along our needle. And you're working a combination of SSK and K1 rather than doing any wrapped stitches or German short rows or anything like that. So I don't even like to call them short rows because I feel like that concerns people. All right, I'm going to begin by slipping one. Now, follow your pattern and be sure that you are knitting the number of stitches that your pattern calls for your size. All right, I've knit the correct number of stitches. Now I'm going to work an SSK, K1. And that's the first right side row of my turned heel. Now, I like to count the stitches on this left needle. I've got 2, 4, 6, 8. Most of my patterns are designed for this number to always be an even number. But most importantly, whatever number of stitches I have here, I should have on the next needle at the end of the next row. So I have 8 stitches here, which is a good guide because on the next row, I should have 8 along the other side of the heel flap. I turn my work, I slip a stitch. This time the yarn's held in front. And I'm going to purl the number of stitches as told to me by the pattern. All right, now I'm going to purl 2 together, purl 1. Looking at this left needle, I'm going to count how many stitches I have. 2, 4, 6, 8. I have 8 stitches now on this side and 8 stitches on this side. I turn my work. I'm going to slip a stitch with the yarn held toward the wrong side, and I'm going to work across, knit across to the visible gap. And what is the visible gap? Look at these stitches. Do you see right here? There's a gap that forms in between the stitches that I'm knitting and the stitches that we left over here. I'm going to knit to 1 stitch before that visible gap. And now I'm going to work an SSK K1. All right, I should have an even number here. If I started with an even number, and I have 6. I turn my knitting, slip 1 with yarn in front, and purl across to the visible gap. Let's take a look at where that is. Okay, if I sort of stretch my stitches out, you can see this gap that appears right here with those 8 stitches over there. Now keep in mind, any number of stitches that I'm using will be dependent on the size that I'm knitting. It may be different for your size. So don't use the stitch count as a guideline based on what I'm doing in this video. Just remember that at the end of each wrong side row, you should have the same number of stitches on either side of the gaps. All right, I purl across to 1 stitch before that visible gap. So I have 1 stitch right here, and I have my remaining stitches here. I'm going to purl these 2 together, which closes that gap, and then I purl 1. Now, it's when I turn my work that I create the new gap. So if I had kept working across, there would be no gap, but there is now because of that, because of the turn. Again, I can check my stitches. I should have the same number on this needle as I have beyond the visible gap on this needle. When you're working a wrong side row, it will not line up because you have not finished that pair of rows. All right, I have finished turning my heel, and this is how it looks. My turned heel is sort of a semicircle that'll be along the bottom of the heel of the foot when this sock is worn. But now we need to pick up stitches and begin working in the round. So we're going to be using those stitches that we've just knit. We're going to be picking up stitches along each selvage edge of the heel flap, and we're going to be working across the stitches that are on my that are currently on hold. I left mine on my 9-inch circulars, but you may have kept those on different needles. All right, I'm not going to use C1 anymore, but I do want to keep this. I'm going to keep it attached for right now, just because I like to weave in the end as I work the bottom of the foot, and I'll show you how I do that. One thing about the pattern is that it tells you to switch to your larger needles, and we are going to use our larger needles for knitting in the round. However, I like to work my stitch pickup on double pointed needles rather than on those 9-inch circulars. I'm going to work the pickup and this first round using my double pointed needles. It's a solid color round. I'm using C5 for the pickup, and so because I'm doing that, it won't be a big deal if I use my size 0s for this pickup, and that way I don't have to have my size 2 double pointed needles on hand. All right, now the pattern is calling for C5. For me, this is pink. In the pictures of the pattern, it is yellow, so my pink is being used in place of the yellow. Now, I'm beginning at this corner. So if you're looking at your heel flap, this is where the heel flap started. That was our beginning of round, and that is where I'm going to join my C5 color. I'm going to begin at that corner with a make one left. Now, if I were to use this top running strand, it still creates a little bit of a gap. And so sometimes what I like to do is pull one of the lower strands to work my make one. And this is how I would do that. So I'm going to take one of these lower strands just to make it a bit more snug. It's going to be a little confusing with all these needles. And then work a make one left where I'm twisting that stitch. Now, it's not going to look great just yet because we don't have any other stitches knit. Now, another thing that you can do instead of working a make one left, it's something that I like to do, but it's difficult to explain. So, because you're watching this video, you get to see another little tip or trick for this sock. What I like to do is take one edge of this stitch that's on my needles. So this was the last stitch of the previous round. I'm going to take that stitch and I'm going to combine it. Sorry, I'm going to take the leg of that stitch and I'm going to combine it with one of the other legs of the same color. So I'm going to combine it with this leg right here. I like to find one where it's not going to create a large gap in my knitting. So I took the leg of the stitch that is on the needles and a leg of the same color that's right above where I worked the heel flap. And I'm going to combine those with a knit two together and join the yarn at the same time. And this is just going to make a tighter stitch than if I just simply worked the make one left. All right. Now it's going to look a bit loose until we get going. So let's get going. Now the next thing that I'm going to be doing is picking up stitches along the selvage edge. And it's tough to see in this particular design because of the dark yarn that I'm using and because of the tightness of using sock yarn. But I wanted to show this whole process on the actual sock. So that was a choice that I made for the video in which it may be difficult to see the selvage edge. And so if you're having more trouble just running a search on picking up knitting along a selvage edge, you'll get some additional tutorial videos that may help you, or just a picture photo tutorial that may show you a close-up. So what I'm doing is going into the selvage edge. So I'm going to go below both legs of the stitch. So I'm going into that. Make sure your selvage is not twisted. You don't want to be going into somewhere along the body of that heel flap. And then I'm going to take the yarn that I'm using, yarn it forward and pull a loop. And that is the first selvage stitch picked up. Now I'm going to go into the next one. So I'm going below both V's of both legs of that stockinette V. So make sure it looks like a stockinette V. Again, it may look very tight. And I'm going to take my yarn and knit underneath that selvage edge. And I'm going to do a few more just so you can see how this looks. If you are an experienced sock knitter, especially if you've done heel flaps and gussets before, I'm sure you are experienced with this. Now my selvage is very tight and I have to be very careful not to split my strands, which can happen a lot with this. All right, so after I've worked a few of them, you can see this line of stockinette V's start to emerge. Or maybe you can. Ideally, you'll be able to see that. And if not, a couple things could be happening. One, it could be that you forgot to slip one of these stitches, in which case there's going to be a bit of a purl bump there, because if you didn't slip it, if you worked it instead, it's going to look a little bit different. But another thing is you could be picking up the wrong part of your selvage stitch. You might be picking up somewhere inside here or alongside here. Now, your pattern will tell you how many selvage stitches need to be picked up, and it's possible that you counted those a little bit earlier, hopefully, so that you have the right stitch count. I'm going to finish picking up this selvage edge, and then I'll show you what to do once we get to these stitches on the needle. Right. I've picked up all of the stitches along this side of the selvage, and you can see this nice, neat line of stockinette selvage stitches. Now, if yours doesn't look perfect, don't worry about it, especially if you're new to sock knitting. The important thing is that it looks nice on this side, because that's the side that faces out. And so if it doesn't look nice, or if you're unhappy with it, you can try that again. You can just take out that needle and work those pickup stitches once again. All right, I am ready to work across my turned heel stitches. And I'm going to weave in this end as I go. I explained how to do this in my tips and tricks color work video on how to weave in your final end as you go. So I'm not going to explain it. I'm just going to show you in practice what that can look like. But one thing I am going to do is count half of these stitches. So for my size, I have 22 stitches on here. I want to have 11 stitches on this needle, and then I'm going to put 11 on the next needle. So I'm going to go ahead and work knitting 11 stitches and showing you what it looks like as I weave in this end as I go. All right, so now I have my make one stitch. I have my picked up selvage stitches, and I have the first half of my heel flap. Now I'm going to go ahead and use my next DPN to work the remaining 11 stitches on this needle. Again, your stitch count may be different depending on what size you are knitting. So use your pattern to tell you how many stitches you should have. All right, and I've worked my final turned heel stitch. I'm going to snip my yarn. And you can see that method of weaving in that end as I go. That dark yarn was just trapped along the wrong side of the knitting. All right, now I'm ready to pick up my stitches along the selvage edge once again. I don't know how your knitting looks, but I do find that one of my selvage edges creates slightly larger stitches. So on this side, it's actually a little bit easier to see these selvage stitches than it was on the first side. And that just has to do with how I'm knitting the beginning of the row versus the end of a row. But once these stitches are picked up, it won't really matter how those look. So I'm going to go into the first stitch, remembering to go under both legs of that stockinette V. Yarn forward and pull that loop through. And that's my first picked up stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and pick these up and count as I do it. All right, let me show you how that looks. This is where we cut my tail. But you can see these stockinette stitches creating this line right here, surrounded by my picked up stitches. All right, I have picked up all of my selvage stitches. You can see that nice clean line of selvage stitches. Again, don't worry if yours doesn't look clean on the wrong side. The important thing is that it looks neat on the right side. I'm ready to work a make one left, which I can of course do, and that is written in the pattern to work this next stitch as a make one left. But what I like to do is combine one leg of this white stitch that's right here attached to my heel flap with one leg of the white stitch that's either, I like to actually use this stitch that's just below the one on the needles for this side of the heel flap. I use that leg right there. So I'm going to take the right leg of this second stitch on the needle, and I hold on to the stitch that's currently on there because I don't want to unknit that stitch. And then I take the left leg of that white stitch that's right there, and I'm going to knit those two together. Again, you can work a make one left. This is just one little way that I found to sort of tighten up that area a little bit better, especially when I'm knitting colorwork socks. I like to do that. You could also do it on non-colorwork socks. I just really like to do it because of the difference in fabric created by the colorwork versus single color. All right, and now I'm going to knit my way across these stitches that are on my larger needles. Once again, you can be doing this pickup on larger DPNs or on larger needles. You don't have to use DPNs. You can use magic loop or whatever you prefer. I just like to do it this way. And there we have it. All of my picked up stitches. My C5 color is right here and my current beginning of the round. Now, this design uses a gusset on the bottom of the heel. The gusset is going to be down here, and if you are not sure what that looks like, you can refer to my Everlasting socks pattern or my World's End socks pattern, both of which show you what the gusset on the bottom of the heel will look like. Now, we're going to shift the beginning of the round to the start of the gusset. So the beginning of the round will now be around here at the beginning of the gusset. The gusset is going to be the very first thing that we work for this round. Now, because of the need to make this sock symmetrical, we're actually going to have one extra stitch over here before the gusset than we do over on this side, and you'll see why once we get going. I am going to go ahead and rejoin my larger needles. So I'm going to be using these 9-inch circulars to work the next part. So this is the gusset setup. If you have a marker marking your beginning of the round, be sure to remove it. And now I'm going to knit, for my size, I'm going to be knitting 19 stitches. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I am going to weave in this end as I go, just by holding it double, pulling it snug, just to get that out of the way. I like to hold it double just for 4 or 5 stitches. And now that's woven in, and I just have to remember that these are single stitches when I come back to them. All right, I've worked the first 19 stitches, and now I'm going to place a new beginning of round marker. So here's where my beginning of round marker will go now. All right, at this point, I'm ready to work the part of the pattern that says next round. I'm going to be joining C2. For me, C2 is in purple. So I'm going to get my purple ready to go. And I'm going to be working row 2 of the gusset chart. Now, we've already worked row 1. That was my solid color. Again, I'm using pink instead of the yellow. And I've already worked all of those first row of stitches. So do not work row 1. But instead, you're going to begin with row 2. So row 2 actually begins with C2. For me, it will be purple, being an SSK. And then I'm going to be working 3 of the C5 stitches. For me, that's pink. Then 1 purple, 5 pink. I'm going to go ahead and work the first row of the gusset, and then I'll be placing a marker to note the end of the gusset. All right, I've worked row 2 of the gusset. I'm holding the purple in my left hand because I want that poinsettia to be the dominant color. So the purple is being held in my left hand. So wherever you're holding your dominant color, I recommend that you make it the pattern poinsettia. And now I'm ready to begin row 2 of the Christmas gifts. So again, follow your chart for your size, but this is how mine looks. And I'm going to begin by placing a marker to indicate the end of the gusset. So I have just worked the final stitch of row 2 of the gusset, and now I'm going to begin working those Christmas gifts. All right, I've just got this one DPN left before all of my stitches are onto my 9-inch circulars. And if you would like, you can place markers in between the repeats of the colorwork patterning. I don't like to do that just because I feel like it slows me down, but that is completely up to you if you would like to do so. All right, and that completes row 2 or round 2. I worked row 2 of the gusset, then row 2 of my Christmas 3 chart, and I am back to the beginning of the gusset. So again, this gusset is going to go between the markers right along the bottom of the heel, and then I'm going to be working the Christmas gift color work all around here as I begin to narrow that gusset, slowly decreasing the stitches away. All right, my gusset is now complete, and this is one of the most confusing parts of the pattern for me to write, but it's actually not hard to work. So I have completed all of the gusset chart, and then what I've gone ahead and done is worked the next round. So for size medium, I have gone ahead and worked row 29, but I've stopped before the final stitch. And what I'm going to be doing is taking these 3 stitches, so the last stitch of the round, the only stitch left of the gusset, and the first stitch past the gusset. I'm going to be taking those 3 stitches and I'm going to be working a central double decrease. I'm also going to be placing a new beginning of the round marker. So here's what I'm going to do in order to reclaim these markers and to get ready to work that central double decrease. First, I'm going to slip the last stitch of the round purlwise and then remove the marker. I will slip that gusset stitch purlwise and remove the marker. Now I'm going to put both of those stitches back onto the left needle, and I'll be ready to work a central double decrease. But before I do that, I'm going to place a marker to indicate my new beginning of round. So this is now my new beginning of round. I'm going to work a central double decrease. And now I can continue on in pattern. I no longer have a gusset chart to work. It is all finished, and I have removed a stitch. So you'll see that on your chart, some of the stitches are grayed out because you are no longer working those stitches. You no longer need it to be symmetrical on either side of a gusset, so we don't need that stitch anymore. Thank you so much for joining me. You can find this design and all of my designs on Ravelry and paperdaisycreations.com. And as always, I wish you very happy knitting.